And thanks everyone for joining this afternoon. I was looking at the attendee list as it was coming in and some familiar names. For those of you I'm not familiar with, thanks for joining. And I'm excited to talk to you a little bit today about structured decision making for lake habitat restoration. First, real quick, though, I do want to introduce myself and the work that I do with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So I work, as Joe had mentioned in my lovely introduction, out of the Fish and Wildlife Service's Green Bay field office, and I am the branch lead for our Partnerships and Habitat program. So we support the mission of the Fish and Wildlife Service by working in partnership with a pretty broad range of partners. Our program is focused on the entire Lake Michigan basin. So we have a pretty big group of partners that we're working with. And our goal is to help our partners with on-the-ground work for conservation and restoration of aquatic species and the habitats that they rely on. And part of this work that I do, assists with administering the National Fish Passage Program, the National Fish Habitat Partnership, including the MGLP, and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative efforts for the Lake Michigan Basin. So we try to work with our partners to identify projects and resources for conservation and restoration work. But today I'm here to talk to you about structured decision making and how we can work towards aquatic species and habitat restoration and conservation in a strategic, concerted way. And as conservation practitioners, we may be faced with a whole bunch of different issues and challenges as we're working to help protect functional habitats that are healthy, naturally diverse, and support self-sustaining biological communities. So why this topic on structured decision making? When I first came into this job at the Fish and Wildlife Service, I was faced with a lot of decision-making challenges and ones that I wasn't sure how to approach and how to find the best solution for them. And I asked a lot of questions and sought counsel and started learning about this structured decision-making process and found that the framework gave me a whole new way of thinking about perspectives and challenges and how to find the solution for some of the tricky problems that we're facing. And so I wanted to share some of these broad concepts and ideas with you today and to start some conversation and hear more about some of the work that you all might be doing. So what is structured decision making? This is at play in quite a bit of the work that we've been doing. And broadly speaking, it's a framework focused on organized analysis of all the problems that we have on hand that we might be facing during a project. And it's a tool, and you'll hear me say that quite a bit, it's a tool in our conservation toolbox to make decisions that help us keep focused on achieving our fundamental objectives. And this is kind of I think of it a bit as an unwieldy diagram. There's a lot of moving parts and there's a lot going on here, but that's what we face often with these large restoration and conservation goals are these big moving parts. So structured decision making is a way to combine decision theory and risk analysis to help us identify what are our objectives, what are the tricky challenges, how do we address the uncertainty that comes about naturally in restoration work. So every time we do a restoration or a conservation action, there's uncertainty that's tied to what is the end result going to be? We have an idea and a projection, but will it follow that? So there's uncertainty that we want to bring into it. And we want to be able to respond to our work as practitioners in a way that is clear and transparent. And so this was a lot of jargon and a lot of words tied into what is structured decision making. So I want to break it down into, how can we implement this in real life? As resource managers, you may be facing a lot of challenges to lake habitat restoration or restoration in other systems as well. This could involve competing interests, priorities, and goals from the stakeholders, partners, or decision makers involved. So a lot of times there's a whole range of people who are part of these projects, and they might be landowners, they might be local conservation groups, they might be your local, state, federal biologists that have authority over some of these resources. It could even be interest from businesses or organizations that want to utilize the commercial aspect of a resource. So there's a lot of stakeholders with competing interests involved with the maintenance or management that's happening. You may be part of a board or an organization that has limited resources, like enough money to complete a project or the technical expertise to plan for habitat restoration. You could be faced with multiple decision-making on behalf of multiple species that have competing management needs. So non-native fish of high recreational value versus native fish that have a high ecological value. There could be rules and regulations that are in place that might be limiting or at least directing the kinds of actions that can take place. Or it could even be something like a large area of priority for the restoration prioritization. So you could be working in a very large area that can be hard to try to implement or prioritize work in such a big space. So, and then on top of all of these challenges that we could be facing as decision makers, there's kind of that big looming one that is climate change. How do we take into consideration the future climate impacts that we want to think about that are going to help us build these resilient lake habitats and protect our resources? So we face challenges. How do we work through them? And how do we best implement kind of our practices and restoration efforts? And we can use structured decision-making for that. And pulling in structured decision-making as this framework helps us do strategic habitat restoration with all of these challenges in mind. So I have a couple examples of what this could look like, supporting recreational fishing in a habitat, or in a lake system, maintaining or enhancing access for recreational use, reconnecting habitats. So many of our glacial lake systems have inflows and outflows. It could even be a chain of lake system where there could be impeded access between them, either for recreation or for our aquatic organisms and their passage. Water quality and associated algal blooms are often a big issue that can be faced by our lake systems. It could even be something like we have a really high valued recreational fishery, but we want bigger fish for either competitions or maybe because our recreational users are asking for bigger fish to use or for these systems. And then there's also, the need for creating habitat. A lot of the actions that we've had just within our society have impacted the state of habitats throughout the region. And so it could be simply as simple as trying to build back habitats and restore what used to be in a system. Excuse me. So here's where Joe had mentioned earlier, I had some questions. I just gave a couple examples, but what I'd really like to know is from everyone listening, do you have any examples of what kind of decisions are you facing right now for habitat restoration? And so I would like to encourage you to open up your chat box and feel free to talk about a couple of these ideas. And so we're talking about strategic decision-making regarding lake habitat. And I had some of those examples in there and what that could be. But what are you facing? Or what decisions have you faced? And if you're not in a position where you've asked this question, the hypothetical, what kind of examples can you think of? Because my list wasn't very exhaustive. Quiet chat box today. Oh, there we go. Thanks, Lisa. How to control aquatic invasive species with limited resources and not rely on herbicides. It's an excellent example. And Laura said, how to restore aquatic plants when lake contractors are herbiciding invasives. Yes. And Tina's concerned about treating the lake for invasive weeds versus causing algal blooms. These are great. Yeah, I'm starting to see a theme here of something that I clearly missed in my examples. Jen Johnson, thanks. Maybe whether to take out a dam that is outdated and work with landowners. That's an excellent question, Jen, and we face this quite a bit for aquatic organism passage. And how do you balance? Yeah, how do you balance the lake landowner perspective, especially if they want to maintain a certain water quality or recreational access? Good. how to reach the landowners, help them understand best management practices, that communication piece. I'll touch on that a little bit too. Working in large lake systems to balance recreational and landscape use with needs for natural environment. Yeah, Tom, that's a really key one too. And Brooke says dealing with erosion and changing lake levels. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate the perspective coming from you all out there. Scott said the efficacy of, the efficacy of various in-lake habitat projects. Yeah, spawning reefs, fish sticks, fish cribs. That's an excellent question. Are these practices working, and to what degree? What practices are beneficial to the species to be considered? That's an excellent example. And then algal blooms. There have been an issue in several lakes. Yep, I heard that. How do you balance plant control versus the really large and possibly toxic algal blooms? Armoring a shoreline versus the natural shoreline restoration, especially during high water levels. And that can be a huge impact that changes we're seeing with climate change, those increasing rain events and storm events that are changing the water levels. How to convince riparians not to use lawn fertilizer. Yeah, Tina, that's great. Nathan said, an inlet and an outlet on our glacial lakes that's loaded with spatterdock. Yeah. The shoreline is also loaded with spatterdock, an invasive plant. We have a history of harmful algal blooms. The beds of spatterdock provide fish habitat and help absorb and filter nutrients, but boaters frequently complain that these areas need to be cleared. Yeah, I talk about that a little bit coming up too. Good. Restoring and preventing future erosion from lakefront parks and trails while affording the public access to the lakes. Good. Yeah, access is a big part. Human use and the human dimensions of our decisions are a big part of it. And that's kind of what we'll get into a little bit too with the structured decision making. Environmental considerations should be factored into the decision to approve submarine utility cables. Yeah, especially when it could be interfering with fish habitat. Good. Climate change vulnerabilities and resiliencies. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. These are really fantastic examples, and I appreciate your input as I was thinking of, my limited list. Thanks for helping bring to light a lot of what our practitioners are facing all the time with our decisions on what do we do about lake management. And so I have a hypothetical that I'm going to be using in my presentation today. And so I just encourage you to, as I'm going through this, think about it in terms of the questions that you're facing and how my hypothetical can be applied to your situations. So I'm gonna move on. Thank you again for those really great suggestions and examples of what you're facing. I wanted to talk just a little bit real quick before we get into this, because this is part of my example. To talk about the challenges that I mentioned before, especially the one that's revolving around climate change. So there's a conservation and restoration guide to help practitioners incorporate climate smart practices into our work. And climate smart conservation can help us answer kind of this broad question of what should we be doing differently in light of climate change. In this guidance document, it helps provide guidance to manage for change across the landscape and not just manage for the persistence or historical conditions. So what that means is this guide kind of talks a bit about in your lake, oftentimes we think of what the lake used to be, and this helps think about here's what the lake can be and how to kind of plan for those future scenarios and make the best of what changes are about to come so that we can still maintain recreational use and fishing and try to reduce some negative impacts of either invasive species or harmful algal blooms. So it helps us to manage change across the landscape and not just try to focus on the preservation of what was. And to consider our goals, reconsider our goals for what is reasonable to accept and achieve, and to be proactive in our work to help mitigate climate change and the impacts that could be occurring, and adapting our work to that. So I had mentioned the climate smart principles. These are actions that we can take knowing that climate change is going to be impacting our lake systems. And so the climate smart principles consider including reducing non-climate stresses. So this could be minimizing local human stressors like pollution. Some people have mentioned runoff and fertilizers or herbicides. So pollution is going to be impacting climate change and compounding it. So trying to reduce that. It could also be helping the ability of species or ecosystems to withstand or adjust climatic events. And so if we can reduce those non-climate stressors, it can help that system become more resilient when faced with climate issues. Protecting key ecosystem features, so focusing management on structural characteristics, the biotic assemblages of areas. Somebody had mentioned looking at the habitat success of these different practices, and that's a big part of this, to which ones work best to protect those key ecosystem features, and what is representing those really important underpinnings or keystones of our system, so that we know maybe focusing on what to protect. Ensuring connectivity. There's a couple examples of the inflows and outflows. So protecting, restoring, and creating landscape features like corridors and stream connections that facilitate the movement of water, energy, nutrients, and organisms along a resource path. And then restoring the structure and function of our systems. So this could involve like rebuilding, modifying, or transforming the ecosystem that has been lost so that it can still function correctly, like with flood mitigation efforts. Support the evolutionary potential of our species. And so this could be protecting a variety of species or populations in places where we can maybe hedge our bets against the losses from climate disturbances. So we want to protect these really key populations so that if we lose them in one place, maybe we still have that resource that exists somewhere else. And then protecting refugia. So these are all actions that we can take now, looking at our lake ecosystems. What can we do in the here and now to help it function as best as possible, so that in light of climate change, we're hoping that it can still be a resilient system. But then in light of climate change, what are the conservation and restoration actions that we can take? So before that was, all those non-climate stressors that are happening in our systems and how to address those. This is knowing that climate change could be impacting it. What can we do? So we integrated some of these examples into, how do we do strategic planning and work alongside of these other projects that we're already doing. And that could be, restoring floodplain connectivity, an aquatic organism passage, making sure that inflows and the outflows to our lake systems are intact and restored to help facilitate the movement of water and species, to help protect species. Identifying and protecting the cold water inputs to a system. So maybe this is a spring that's coming as an inflow, or even cold water seeps, groundwater discharge. So knowing that these areas exist and are impacting our lakes, protecting them, and that could be, providing overhead plantings, ensuring that they don't get built so that construction isn't tearing apart these cold water influences, because those are going to help buffer the water temperatures in our systems. Increasing the canopy cover around lake systems when possible, or around the tributaries that might be feeding into it, can help buffer those water temperatures. Increasing the vegetated buffers along a lake or along the tributaries, inflows and outflows, to help with filtration, having some kind of, when possible, filtration units in place, ways that the natural land cover that will help maybe slow down the surface flow. And we talked, somebody had mentioned a couple times about lawn runoff that's coming in, and fertilizers that could be contributing to harmful algal blooms. Having some of these natural plant buffers as buffer strips in place to help slow down, reduce, and maybe even absorb those nutrients before they come into the system. reducing or retaining the surface runoff, either from parking lots or roads, especially regarding road salt that can have a big impact on salinization of lake systems. And then, like I mentioned before too, is those aquatic connectivity barriers. So making sure that those are not in place. And there's also other things for, I think, preventing aquatic invasive species, or how do we manage aquatic invasive species. So working with your stakeholders to have maybe check points in place, or having reminders and outreach materials to warn people of, as you're transporting a boat lake to lake to, wash out and try to dry out and remove any invasives, so that you're not introducing them or perpetuating them in a system. So these are all actions that we can take. Now, you may be thinking that I've got a little bit off the rails and not really focused on the strategic decision making, but I wanted to provide examples of, we as practitioners, we face challenges, lots of them, and your examples that you put in the chat just show the huge breadth of everything that we're trying to balance and manage in our aquatic systems. So I wanted to provide kind of an outline. I didn't like that flow chart before, and sorry, that is a Fish and Wildlife Service graph, but I just think it's kind of unwieldy and a little bit hard to digest. So what I did was I reworked it a little bit, and I'm going to try to provide a couple of examples of what it looks like to implement strategic decision making from a different perspective, or a different way of visualizing it. So if we take our problem at hand, and we're trying to figure out, what do we do? How do we tackle it? So the base of this is their structured decision making. And we're going to add in, identifying what are these challenges and objectives? What are we facing? Is this issues with stakeholders and competing priorities? Is it issues with non-climate stressors, pollution or land use, or aquatic connectivity barriers? Is it climate stress? So trying to figure out, what are the challenges that we face, and what are we trying to overcome in our management goals? Bringing in that stakeholder engagement, it can be tricky. You can have a lot of partners at the table that have competing priorities and interests, and it gets really hard to balance. How do we compromise? How do we bring people on board with the best actions? And this isn't easy, and it's not always something that becomes, a resolution. You can't make everybody happy, but it's a step as part of this process. And then what was listed in that diagram earlier, something called linked decisions. And so many important decisions that we make are linked over time. And so how can we look at these actionable items and find ways of resolution? And the key to dealing effectively with linked decisions is to kind of isolate the near-term issues and work through them stepwise, prepare for what's coming down the road, and trying to get the information as clear as possible and laid out to the partners. And so saying, here's these first couple steps. We know that something else is looming down the road, but let's accomplish this first. And so it's just a phrase called linked decisions. And then we take our restoration action, what it is that we're hoping to accomplish in our lake system. So maybe it's the invasive species removal, maybe it's stocking of fish, maybe it's looking at the habitat structures and what is the one that is going to provide the best outcome for supporting a species or reaching a target. And then, our hopeful end result are these large-scale lake habitat restoration and achieving those goals. So this was my way of maybe rethinking that structured decision-making and looking at it kind of as this process that builds up and then builds out. And so, whichever graphic works better for you, I just wanted to provide a different way of thinking about it. And then I wanted to come up with this example too, to talk through with you. And like I had mentioned before, you had all have provided this really great real world examples. But here's one that I kind of made up, and it's an amalgamation of a lot of different problems that have been faced in the work that we've been doing here. So my example, if you can visualize it and maybe think alongside of what you're working through as well, is let's say that you are the manager of a 60-acre Midwest glacial lake. It's cold water fed. And historically, the fishing in this lake was supported mostly by brook trout. So this was a brook trout system. And the fishery has been declining in recent years. And the stakeholders, as part of this, have been saying, we need a fishery in this lake. Our brook trout are disappearing. Do something. Okay. So how do you manage or restore lake habitat in this system to support a recreational fishery? So I'm going to kind of walk through a couple of the big overarching things that I was thinking about. So we have a few problems at hand. One, and maybe it's not necessarily a problem, but it's a challenge potentially, but I called it a problem here because we have challenges too. The problem is that we have a large management area, 60 acres. And so for context, I like to visualize things, and I cannot visualize what 60 acres is. A football field, one football field is 1.32 acres. So 60 acres is the equivalent to approximately 45 and a half football fields. Okay, so that's why I said the problem here is you have a really big lake, and how do you begin implementation, prioritization, finding the funding? What do you do on a lake this size? So you have a big system. And the historical fishery has diminished, and the request is do something. Okay, so we want to, whether that's bringing back brook trout or something else, the stakeholders want to increase recreational fishing. Oh, thank you so much, Julia, for bringing in that NIFWIF document for the climate smart conservation. I appreciate it. For our examples, so we have some challenges too. So the challenges are likely going to be the climate impacts to this system. If we have this lovely cold water fed lake and our brook trout population is diminishing, climate's probably going to be a big part of it. Climate change is impacting fisheries throughout the region already, and it's projected to get worse. We're seeing increasing water temperatures and changes in the precipitation patterns. And a lot of this is exacerbated by those non-climate stressors that I mentioned earlier, by land use, by disconnect and barriers to aquatic organism passage. A lot of things are kind of compounding that. So some of the other challenges that you might be facing in this scenario is that there's other species in the system, or there's other species that stakeholders want to see come into play. So when you have a cold water obligate species like brook trout, our suite of cold water species for recreational fishery isn't as diverse. There's quite a bit more in warm water systems in terms of diversity and what people often seek out, bass and pike. And so it could be that people want some of these other species in place. And there could also be non-target wildlife that is part of the challenge in this. And this comes from the example that I'm going to give later on the decisions that we're going to be making. And so if you're wondering, how does non-target wildlife fit into this? You can think about other wildlife on a system. So geese or muskrats that could be coming in that people often think of as nuisance and they don't want them around. So how do the decisions we're going to be making, remember I talked about those linked decisions. How does a decision we make right now impact what's going to happen later? And so it could be that a decision we're making now to restore certain habitats could then lead to the establishment of muskrat or geese or some other wildlife that people may not want in a system. So there's challenges that we're going to be facing. And then what are the objectives? Overall, we have some objectives of, we want to increase recreational fishing. And right now I haven't explicitly stated, what does that mean? Do we want brook trout back, or do we want something else? That wasn't presented to you. So that the question was, fix the recreational fishery, do something. We want recreational fishing on this lake. Our brook trout are gone. So we want to increase opportunities for recreational fishing on our lake system. We want to restore habitat that's going to be tied to that, because whatever fishery we put in place, we're going to need to ensure that the habitat there is there to support it, so that it becomes a self-sustaining fishery as well, because the actions that we take, we're hoping will maybe be short term, so that we're not constantly having to do management every year to ensure that that fishery is in place. But what could we potentially do that would make it sustainable? So I just want to kind of flash back real quick to that little diagram that I created that was looking at, that sequence of structured decision making, identifying all these problems, the challenges and our objectives, and those linked to decisions in there. What I had mentioned earlier about what we do is going to have other impacts, kind of like a few dominoes falling, and how are we going to address that? So it's decision time. We want to improve recreational fishing in a 60-acre lake. The problem is the fishing's lost, and our stakeholders have said, do something. So we have to balance, the priorities, balance the needs and the goals, and balance the climate impacts. And there's a lot that's kind of at play here. And when we bring in our stakeholders, we want to talk about, all right, what does everybody want? Can we come to a consensus? There might be stakeholders who are preservationists, who, because brook trout has been the historical species in there, they don't want to see it change to anything else. They only want brook trout. You could have stakeholders who are interested in a different type of recreational fishery, maybe bringing in northern pike or smallmouth bass or yellow perch, something that is different. And maybe because pike can be a little bit more aggressive on the hook, bringing in something that's a different challenge. And so you have to work through all of those different perspectives on what that could look like, and then what are the efforts that are needed for it. So if we're trying to maintain that brook trout fishery, there's going to be a lot of work to resist the changes that are going to be coming from climate impacts. So how do we buffer that water temperature? How do we ensure that, it doesn't warm beyond the thermal threshold of brook trout? So a lot of plantings along the shoreline. And is there space to do that? Is there landowner agreement to do that? Or having those buffer strips? And again, if you have a really, really developed lake, which may not be a brook trout lake to begin with, but if you have, a highly developed lake, if there's not space to be able to do some of those mitigation actions, or even looking further up into the watershed at that landscape level of what can we do at those inlets to ensure that the water coming in is stable and cold? How do we protect the springs and the cold water seeps? That's a lot of effort. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of time. So when we're trying to balance that the needs and the wants and those priorities and challenges, can we do that? Do we have the resources, the money, the space, the land? Is everything in play to be able to kind of resist climate change and try to maintain brook trout? I'm going to say no in this situation, knowing that, it's hard. That's a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of effort. And I would say in this situation, it's better to accept that the system is moving in a different direction. We likely wouldn't be able to balance and mitigate buffer those water temperatures enough to protect the historical fishery of brook trout. So let's accept that it's moving in a different direction. And the original request of our stakeholders is, we've lost our recreational fishery, do something. And so in this example, we're going to direct the fishery to a different population. And so let's say, through our stakeholder consensus, you could bring in a suite of warm water fish, but let's say that in this instance, they really want to see yellow perch as the dominant recreational fishery on here. So if we're going to redirect it to warm water and bring something else in, we're going to then need to do habitat management within our system and potentially build habitat for these fish. And so oftentimes, especially in a lake system, yellow perch are going to need wetlands and emergent vegetation as their nursery habitat. So if we want to build out that population, we need to ensure that the habitat is intact for yellow perch. And that, remember, I had mentioned before that that chain of decisions, those linked decisions. So if we want to build a yellow perch fishery and we're going to need wetlands for it, getting stakeholder agreement and engagement on that in itself could potentially be difficult because, there could be stakeholders that don't like how emergent vegetation looks. They want to look out their door and see smooth water. They don't want to see, a weedy patch. It could be that, recreational access or boater access could be impeded by wetlands in there. And so you could have stakeholders saying, well, I don't want a bunch of wetlands and emergent vegetation or even submergent vegetation as nursery habitat, because that's going to harm, it's going to get tangled up in my boat motor prop, and that's going to make it really hard to motorboat around this lake. So I don't want emergent vegetation. This could be, as I had mentioned before, that linked decisions. Building out wetland habitat in the system, you could end up with muskrats coming in, or geese or other wildlife that are, obligates to wetlands or use wetland habitat. And, how do you work and communicate the needs for a whole diverse set of species within a system, and that, some lake owners may, or excuse me, some stakeholders may view them as nuisance species. So then there's that to contend with. And so there's a lot of habitat management decisions based on how do we want to redirect this fishery and build out something to then create a sustainable fishery as our end goal. That initial request of, we've lost our recreational fishery, do something. So this is kind of that stepwise structured decision making, try to take in all of these competing and outside aspects of this, and how do you work through it to get to that goal or that end result. So in closing, I just kind of want to go through my goal for this presentation was to start a conversation on how we can work towards aquatic species and habitat restoration conservation in a strategic, concerted way. And I wanted to provide just, maybe a different perspective on what this could look like. As conservation practitioners, and I've said this a couple of times, and I just want to restate it, we face a lot of challenges in our efforts to try to do habitat restoration and conservation work to protect habitats and the species that they support. And so this presentation was just meant to kind of showcase one way, using structured decision making as a way to consider habitat restoration in lake systems, and how to kind of step through it with that framework. And the structured decision making framework is guidance. It's just one tool in our conservation toolbox to help us accomplish our work. And I think that this tool can be really adaptable, but is by no means the only tool that's available to you. And lastly, I kind of want to emphasize that the role of the stakeholder engagement and partnerships have such a big place in our conservation process. And it can be really difficult balancing competing priorities and interests and expectations and engagement level. And it can be a tough step, but it really is kind of a key part of trying to make a project successful. And I think that's one of the hardest parts of the structured decision-making aspect, is that communication and buy-in from so many different partners. So that's it. That's all I have for my presentation today. And it does look like we have a bit of time left over. And so what I'd really like to do is, open this up. If you have questions, I'd love to answer questions for you. I've also put my contact information on the slide if you want to contact me directly. But I'd really like to open up the floor for maybe some discussion and engagement as well. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time and participation in listening to this today.
Thank you, Dr. Collier, and a really interesting presentation. And we were talking beforehand, and in our discussion beforehand, and I think it was borne out in the material here. This is really interesting stuff, and I haven't personally seen a lot of application of structured decision making within the inland lakes context. So, a lot of food for thought. So, thank you for your contributions here, and I think folks have been really interested. We do have a couple questions coming in on the Q&A function. I'd again encourage folks to submit your questions via the Q&A function. And so let's get to them. The first question from Wade Johnson is, can you provide examples of climate smart projects that have been implemented over the last several years or for several years?
That's a good question, Wade. One moment while I think about that. So a lot of the actions that I had provided were kind of the short term So I want to come back to that. So one of the climate smart practices was ensuring kind of the natural flow and function of a system. And so I think of that as, a re-meandering. Let's say you have a channelized ditch. One of your climate smart projects could be to restore the natural geomorphology, natural water flow of that system. So re-meandering a channelized ditch. Now, that in itself is kind of a one moment in time. Your question has been something that's been implemented for several years. So it's the practice of, not just doing a restoration project and walking away, but continuing to monitor that project to see, did the end goal have the intended response that we were looking for, and then building out on some of those projects. So that one, the example itself may seem like one action, one moment in time, but I'd really emphasize doing a lot of follow-up monitoring to see, how did that system hold up when we had, a massive flooding event? Did the banks stabilize and hold, or did they kind of fall in and we see them washed away, and the what kind of happened after that? And so I don't know if that really answered your question, but I think that a lot of the examples I gave seem like actions, one action in time, but I would say that the continuing to build on those either through the monitoring or even building out into larger pieces, and so building off of one or two projects to create more of that resiliency as ways that we can kind of implement it for several years at a time.
Thanks. Good answer. Next question is, what does stakeholder engagement look like? Is it within some given structure or a specially created one?
That's a really great question, Tom. I would say that it can be within a structure, but it doesn't need to be. I think stakeholder engagement can be a lot of things. And as I've been part of these different working groups around the Lake Michigan Basin, I've seen stakeholder engagement happen in several different forums. And I'll talk about in a moment what I think is a good structure for it. But I think that it could be anything from posting, let's say we want to do a dam removal and we want to get stakeholder engagement, talk to landowners, talk to, the residents nearby. We want to make sure we have their buy-in, and general approval for the project, because we don't want to work against, the general consensus of the stakeholders. So you could post for an open public meeting, and you could post on a variety of forums to just say, announce, we want to have this public meeting. And I've seen that happen several times with our projects where they're putting it out there and saying, we want people to come on board to hear what we're proposing, to hear our ideas. We want to hear your ideas so we can get feedback on them. And so that was just a generalized posting of public forum, come one, come all. Let's introduce this and discuss it. I was part of another stakeholder group that was really fascinating, and I was impressed. It was in the White River watershed in Michigan, and it was the Fremont Community Foundation was leading the efforts. And so they had done their homework, and they had brought in over 50 different stakeholders, and it was everything you could possibly think of. It was landowners, it was rec fishing tour guides. It was a nonprofit conservation groups. It was state DNR. It was federal biologists. It was this massive amount of as many stakeholders as they could get together. They identified them one by one and sent out these emails that said, we want to bring everybody together and we want to talk about this. And they've been coming back time and time again with this large group of people saying, what do you want to see done? What would you envision as good restoration practices? What are our priorities, and getting consensus on priorities? So those are two examples. And I really am sorry I'm taking so long to answer it. So what does it look like, Tom? It can be a variety of things. Is there a structure? I think open dialogue, being, providing the information up front, saying, here's the background, here's what we want to do, and offering that back and forth and hearing the other perspective. So you might have an opposing perspective on something. I don't want it to be this way. I don't want to see this happen. How can we talk about this and maybe try to find some kind of consensus or try to find some middle ground there? I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I think that dovetails pretty nicely then into another question. So you've talked through some of the complexity of really doing good engagement, and this is a specialized skill set, or at least a skill set that is earned over time and experience. And so, do you recommend for either that engagement process or for going through the entire structured decision-making process that folks use a facilitator who's been trained in this? Is this something that lends itself to folks trying, and learning as they go, or how do you recommend that they approach it?
I love facilitation and facilitators, the neutral arbiters of the conversation, who are there, who they don't have a stake in it. They're there to, keep things on track and to help resolve maybe contentious aspects of it. But I think facilitation is an excellent tool. I like it and I recommend it more often than not to help us try to maybe find a consensus, because as I had mentioned, the person facilitating oftentimes doesn't have a stake in it. So they may not have a bias that's there where they're really pushing and trying to get to some final answer. Yeah, I think facilitation is recommended from my perspective, but it depends on the partnership. So I've been part of several partnerships where there's kind of a general agreement from the get-go. There's never been pushback or any type of contention, and from the initial onset of the partnership, most people have been in generalized agreement of how to move forward. And in that case, I don't think that facilitation would be necessary. But what is always important is having somebody in that leadership role that's communicating well and organizing things well and keeping stuff moving. I hope that answered it.
Yeah, and I would agree. Having somebody who has that experience is really helpful. Neutral voice in the room. Okay, is structured decision making best used when a shared stakeholder group or a goal or priority has already been identified, or is that the first step, defining the problem with stakeholder input? So it's a question about, when do you start using the process, before or after you've defined the problem?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, again, I would say it might depend on the situation. And that's one of the things too that I wanted to emphasize with structured decision making, that it's a framework, but it's not a cookie cutter that you always have to apply specifically in certain ways or across the board. And that's why I mentioned too, it's just kind of one tool in our toolbox, and it's important, but it doesn't have to be the only thing to rely on. Back to the original question, I would say that having an idea of that structured decision-making process to know the end goals can sometimes help us determine the partnership and who and how to invite to the table. It could be that you're using structured decision-making for something that's internal. Maybe it's a management board of a lake system, and it could be a difficult problem to work through, but having a lot of outside information may not necessarily be helpful. And I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, except for maybe I think there was a question on communication. How do we work with people to kind of teach them about the fertilizer runoff? So if one of the management decisions that you are facing is really high fertilizer runoff into your lake that's impacting the water quality and fueling harmful algal blooms, structured decision making, you can talk about, well, here's all the different things that we could do. Here's how we can do outreach. Maybe as a board, a lake board, a management board, we can initiate some rules. That's one of the things where I think the board can make those decisions on how to communicate or how to take the management of this without necessarily having to bring in, a DNR biologist or bringing in somebody else, unless you identify as a board, we don't know enough about this, we need more input. So I think the goal and what you're trying to get at, identifying through structured decision making could feed into who your partnerships is. But I don't think it's a chicken or an egg type of thing. I think that you could develop your partnership first and bring your stakeholders to the table and then work through SDM, or you can identify your SDM and then your partnership group.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of learning that goes on during the process. So like going back to what you said, it's maybe not necessarily formulaic. Sometimes you have to be a little bit adaptive in how you apply it. Next question. Do you have any suggestions on how to present ideas regarding looking forward to making our lake more resilient to climate impacts when there are stakeholders who deny the existence of climate change? So
Yeah,
how do we work with those folks that deny climate change?
yeah, that's a really great question, Lisa. I do have a personal anecdote that I think could be helpful here. So if you want to get buy-in from somebody on an idea, sometimes involving them in the process and having them be part of it can assist with buy-in. And I'll give you an exact example of this. We had a dam removal, and one of the landowners, the dam was causing a really high amount of ponding behind it. So it was really holding back the water. And the water temperatures behind it there was actually a 5-degree difference at one point in the year between the water held behind that dam that was ponding and not moving versus the reference reach that was a little further downstream and one that was a little further upstream of that pond. And so with this landowner, they weren't like heels in the ground skeptical of climate change, but they just didn't think that dam could really have that big of an impact. And so we were working with our partners to set out temperature loggers and invited the landowner, said, hey, just come check this out, come see what we're doing. And they got to go out there. They were part of putting the temperature loggers in place throughout different parts of the river. And then they went out when we were checking them, and they actually got to see the reading on the computer showing on this graph this marked difference. And that was kind of evidence for them, and it changed their perspective. They were like, I had no idea. And then talking about what does that 5-degree difference mean to the fish and stuff, and how is that impacting the system? And it really changed their mind. And then they started talking to the other landowners, and they're like, you'll never guess what's happening on my property with these, this temperature changes. And so, Lisa, I don't know that I have a lot of great advice, but if there's an opportunity to bring somebody on board and maybe provide, hands-on, come out here and see this, what you're tracking, maybe have, if you can do temperature readings and say, this is really high, let's go to a place where, the fishery is good and look at the temperatures there. This is much lower, that type of thing. And there's a way of getting that kind of engagement one-on-one and being able to offer the opportunity to see it happening. That's the first suggestion that came to mind. It can be really difficult sometimes. And as we know, if people have made up their mind about something, we cannot change their mind, forcing them, even trying to provide, facts and stuff. It can be tough. I really like engagement, hand in hand. Come check this out. Just see what we're doing. And I think that can go a long way. It's not the best, it's not going to be an answer that works every time. But that one time it happened, man, that was beautiful.
Yeah, and I think you gave a good example there. And one example that I hear a lot, and I've seen have success too, is you talked earlier about when you're addressing climate impacts for lakes. One of the strategies is to address the other stressors in the lake. And often when we're talking about building resilience, what we're talking about is reducing some of those other stressors that are going to be exacerbated by climate change. And so it might be that those stressors are not climate change, they're not inherently climate change related, but that they exacerbate it. And they may be the only levers that we have to pull as managers. And so, for example, water quality. If our objective for a more resilient lake, cold water lake, is to improve water quality, we don't even have to agree that the climate is changing. in order for us to try to achieve our objective of improving or protecting water quality in a lake. We just have to agree that we want the water in this lake to be clean, clear, aesthetically pleasing, and or maybe just that, you know, private property values will increase as a result. So there's you don't necessarily even have to agree to move forward, and if you can find that consensus, that might be a strategy too.
Well said, Joe.
Okay. I am showing that we have gotten through all of the questions in our Q&A. Now I have a couple of questions. And so, but I will offer this as a last call for questions from attendees. If you have any final questions for Dr. Collier, please go ahead and enter them into the Q&A function, and we'll get them answered. So one question, and this is sort of a kind of a next step question. A lot of times you hear structured decision making discussed within an adaptive management framework and enabling adaptive management. And I guess I'm curious if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about how this sets us up and puts us in a position to learn more about the system, and to move forward with an adaptive management approach.
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's a lot to it. So adaptive management, if you aren't familiar with the term, is this way of revisiting and reviewing the results or even the process as it's happening, and kind of it's a check-in. How are things working? Are we accomplishing what we set out to do? Are we seeing the intended results? And if not, kind of go back to the drawing board. What can we what can we kind of reset? What can we adjust within our practice or within our strategy that is going to help us reach our goal and our success? So adaptive management is a check-in during the process to see how things are going. And if it's not going the way that we intended, you know, kind of going back and adjusting and trying it again from a different perspective. So with structured decision-making, I think that there's adaptive management can fit into it throughout the different steps. And so as we're trying to, let's say, I come back to that stakeholder engagement one kind of time and time again. And I think it's because it's a big part of what I do is stakeholder engagement, but it's, you know, trying to get cohesion on a project, and I don't necessarily want to say buy-in, but consensus on how to do something or why to do something. And when that isn't reached, kind of with my example that I had given about the, you know, somebody who isn't believing in climate change, how do you move it forward? Kind of going back to the drawing board, adaptive management in terms of the outreach, the education, and the communication part. If one thing didn't work, let's say you're trying to, there was a question on, you know, how do you do a stakeholder engagement? Is there any one way to do it? If you're not making headway in terms of getting consensus on something, adaptive management, stop, go back, try to visit it from a different perspective, try to incorporate another aspect of it. So I think you can have adaptive management throughout this process. In the example that I gave for, you know, how do we redirect a fishery if we can't sustain brook trout going to something that's maybe warmer water, and maybe you're trying to build a yellow perch fishery in that, and you're not getting the population at the level that you want. Adaptive management, stop, go back. What is missing? What could we be doing differently? Do we need to consider a different species for a recreational fishery in this system? And so I think that these two processes can be really intertwined and kind of build off of each other. But I like the adaptive management approach. We talk about it in our program, even from the way that we are doing things with our own work. You know, if we tried something and it's not quite the results that we are intending, try it again from a different perspective, being open to adjusting and looking at it from a different way, or trying another route if possible. Does that answer it, Joe?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. It's an admittedly big question, and probably, well, assuredly, many webinars could be devoted to just that question. So, and they have been. So I know that that was a good. I think that was a good quick summary. Okay. See, I see no additional questions, and we are about at the top of the hour. So at this point, I think we will wrap up. Again, Dr. Collier, thank you for being willing to present and sharing with us your knowledge and experience today. I think it's been a really helpful and interesting conversation. Again, for our folks that attended or maybe joined late, we are going to send out recordings of this webinar. We'll put those posted on our website along with all of the other archives for all of our past webinars. So if you want to see revisit any parts of this or share it with friends, you're welcome to do that. And we have one more webinar coming up in December to close out the 2021 MGLP webinar season. And then we'll be looking forward to a new slate of webinars in the spring, which we will announce via our newsletter. So stay tuned for that one, everyone. And with that, I think I will close this out and say thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone, for attending and for your great input. It's much appreciated.